She used to think love was measured by how much you could hide to keep another person safe. She learned early that silence could hold a family together better than any promise. So she practiced it every day. Her voice became soft, her steps careful, her eyes a shield for everything that couldn't be said. She remembered the day the silence began. The morning sunlight spilling across the kitchen table, her husband, his hands trembling slightly as he folded a piece of paper too slowly, and she knew without words that something had changed. But she smiled, because that's what love was supposed to look like. She smiled through every doubt, through every long pause that separated one truth from another. She smiled because she believed that if she held the silence long enough, it would turn back into peace. She told herself this was strength. This was what women did. They carried the noise of the world inside them until it became still. She learned how to fill the empty spaces between questions with small acts of care. A meal perfectly timed, a word spoken just when it was needed. A laugh that didn't reach her eyes but made everyone else feel safe. Her daughter once asked her why she always whispered, and she said, "Because words hurt when they're too loud." What she didn't say was that love sometimes sounds like pain folded neatly into calm. Her silence became a kind of language, a secret dialect of survival. Every look, every gesture carried meaning that no one else could hear. She knew the walls in the house remembered the echoes of things unspoken, but she kept cleaning them as if you could scrub memory away. Sometimes, at night, she would lie awake, listening to the rhythm of her husband's breathing, counting the seconds between inhale and exhale, trying to hear what he wasn't saying. She loved him for his distance, for his brokenness, because it gave her purpose. She was the one who could hold him together. Or so she thought. But love built on silence is just a slower kind of erosion. It wears away the truth, grain by grain, until nothing remains but duty and denial. She began to mistake peace for absence and presence for endurance. Each morning, she looked in the mirror and practiced a new expression, one that didn't tremble when she said, "Everything's fine." She wore it like armor through every meal, every night, every glance across the table. She carried her love like a secret too fragile to speak, afraid that if she did, it would dissolve into the air she breathed. She thought that if she stayed quiet enough, long enough, she could protect them all from what was already coming. What said didn't know yet was that silence wasn't protecting her, it was burying her alive, one heartbeat at a time. Every morning began the same, with sunlight spilling through the curtains and the sound of her pretending to be okay. She would move through the house in measured rhythms, brewing coffee, setting plates, her smile practiced like a pianist, repeating the same melody until it no longer required thought. She had learned to wear warmth the way others wore perfume. Something invisible, yet heavy, it clung to her no matter where she went. She smiled because her daughter needed to believe everything was fine, and because her husband needed to believe she hadn't noticed that it wasn't. The truth sat quietly between them like a guest no one acknowledged. When he spoke, she would nod at the right moments, her expression steady, as if his words were wind and she was the wall built to endure it. She told herself that this was love, that keeping the family calm was worth the slow bleeding of herself into nothing. She became fluent in small distractions. She learned that a well-placed laugh could erase a question, and that kindness was sometimes a disguise. She didn't mind being the disguise. She had spent years perfecting the art of appearing whole, even when the cracks beneath her skin began to hum at night. In the kitchen light, she would catch her reflection in the window and study the shape of her smile. It looked foreign to her, stretched too thin, too bright, like a photograph overexposed. She'll depress her fingers to the glass and whisper promises to her reflection to hold on a little longer. One more day, one more breakfast, one more evening where everything appeared normal. Her husband had built the lie, but she was the one keeping it alive, feeding it every time she pretended not to see the truth hiding behind his eyes. She began to notice how exhaustion smelled like burnt coffee and regret, how silence had texture, and how the air grew heavier when he entered the room. She carried their secret without knowing all of it, only enough to understand that it was heavier than love could bear. She thought that maybe if she smiled long enough, it would become real. Maybe if she loved hard enough, it would erase whatever he was hiding. But love can't rewrite history. It can only rewrite the person who gives it. She was disappearing slowly, like a candle burning without a flame, giving light, but no heat. When their daughter laughed, she felt both joy and fear. Joy, because innocence still existed somewhere in this house. Fear, because she knew how quickly silence could take it away. She sometimes wondered who she would be without the weight of pretending. She imagined a version of herself who didn't flinch at the sound of her own name spoken too softly. She imagined being seen not as the glue that held the cracks together, but as someone allowed to break. She smiled at the thought, and it felt real for half a second. Then she picked up her cup and smiled again, because pretending was easier than hoping. She had always seen pieces of herself in her daughter, but lately those pieces looked sharper, more aware. She noticed how the girl's eyes followed conversations, how she paused before answering, as if measuring what truths were safe to speak. It frightened her because she recognized the same hesitation, the same quiet calculation she had spent a lifetime perfecting. The girl was learning the language of silence without being taught. She wanted to tell her that some secrets were not protection, but poison. But the words never found their way past her lips. Every time she tried to begin, her voice broke into a whisper, too fragile to survive the air. She wondered when love had turned into fear. Fear of saying too much. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of losing the fragile balance that held them together. Her daughter would sit by the window reading, tracing the outline of faces in old photographs, asking small questions about moments that didn't add up, questions that pressed gently at the edges of the family myth. She would answer with half-truths and smiles, the kind that fooled everyone except the one who had learned to wear the same mask. One afternoon, she caught her daughter watching her in the mirror. Their eyes met, and it felt like time itself held its breath. There was no accusation, only recognition. The girl saw her mother ese exhaustion, the way she carried love, like a burden, and shame like an heirloom. She wanted to tell her that she was proud of her strength, but afraid of the silence she was in. Instead, she said nothing. The daughter looked down, but her reflection stayed still, and that was when she understood that silence, too, could be passed from parent to child like an unspoken vow. She began noticing small imitations, the way her daughter folded her hands when anxious, The way she smiled without showing teeth. The way she said, "It's fine," with a tone too old for her age. Every gesture felt like a mirror reflecting back her own mistakes. She wanted to break it to reach across that invisible barrier of quiet, but years of restraint had turned her into her own cage. She thought of the nights she spent listening to her husband breathe beside her, knowing something inside him was breaking, and realizing she was breaking too, but in a different way. She was becoming invisible. Slowly, lovingly, invisibly. One day, her daughter asked her if silence could hurt. She hesitated before saying, "Only when it lasts too long." The girl nodded and returned to her book, but the questions stayed in the air, like dust caught in light. Later that night, she opened her daughter's notebook. Out of fear, not curiosity. Inside were lines that felt like echoes of her own thoughts, fragments of pain wrapped in beautiful words. One sentence stopped her. "Greater than I think my mother speaks louder when she says nothing." She closed the book carefully, heart trembling, and for the first time, she realized her daughter didn't need to hear the truth. To know it, she was already living it. It came quietly, as most endings do, not in screams or shattered glass, but in a sentence spoken too softly to be denied. She was standing in the doorway of his study, the light dim, the air stale with old dust and older memories. He didn't see her at first. His voice low as he read from a letter, words meant for someone else, not her. Not their daughter, someone who no longer belonged to this life. She knew the tone before she knew the meaning. She had lived inside its echoes for years. When he finally looked up, his face emptied of color. She didn't ask how long. She didn't ask why. She simply said, "I understand." Her calmness frightened him more than any rage could have. She turned away before he could speak again, her heart beating like a clock, trying to keep up with a world that had already ended. She walked down the hall, her hands shaking against the wallpaper, feeling every pulse of the house, as if it too had been waiting for this confession. The walls that once held her silence now returned it, louder, heavier. She reached the kitchen and stopped where so many mornings began. She thought of the countless times she had smiled across the table and believed it was strength. The line now stood beside her, almost tender like an old companion, reminding her of everything she sacrificed in its name. She wanted to cry, but no tears came. Instead, there was clarity, sharp and cold. She realized the truth didn't hurt, because it was cruel. It hurt because it was familiar. She had known it all along, just refused to name it. Love had become a translation error, a word that once meant giving but had turned into erasing. She remembered the night their daughter asked if silence could hurt. She almost laughed now, because she finally knew the answer. It doesn't just hurt. It reshapes you. It carves you into something that looks whole from a distance, but is hollow inside. She sat at the table, where years of pretending had played out the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, all sounding like witnesses. She looked at her hands, steady now, calm, and thought about how many lives she had lived inside this one body. The wife, the mother, the peacekeeper, the believer in second chances. But beneath them all was someone else, someone she had buried under layers of patience and forgiveness. That woman was breathing again tonight, fragile, but alive. She heard her husband's steps behind her, the sound of guilt trying to find its footing. He said her name softly, but she didn't answer, not because she was angry, but because words had done enough damage. She let silence speak for her, and for the first time, it wasn't love or fear. It was truth, raw and undeniable. It filled the room, it filled him, until there was nothing left to hide. They stood there for a long time, two people finally stripped of the stories they told themselves. And in that quiet ruin, she found something close to freedom. Morning arrived without ceremony, no apology, no warning. The sunlight slipped across the kitchen floor, touching everything it had touched the day before, but nothing was the same. She sat by the window, still wearing last night's silence. It didn't ache the way she expected it to. It felt lighter, almost foreign. She realized she had carried silence for so long it had become a second heartbeat, and now, without it, her chest felt strangely empty. She could hear the world again, the rustle of trees, the faint hum of life beyond the house she had built around their lie. Her husband moved quietly in the other room, the air between them stripped of all the performances that once kept them safe. She did not hate him. She didn't even pity him. She simply saw him as he was. A man who mistook fear for love, the way she mistook love for She rose from her chair and walked through the house, touching the walls the way one might touch a wound, to see if it still hurts. They no longer whispered, they simply stood, honest, unguarded. She entered her daughter's room and saw a small note on the desk, written in her delicate hand. It said, "Greater than you don't have to be quiet anymore." The words dissolved, her resolve like rain on dust. For the first time in years, she let herself cry, not in shame, not in despair, but in recognition. She cried for the woman she used to be, the one who thought silence was devotion. She cried for the girl she once was, who learned to speak softly, to be loved. And she cried for her daughter, who would now know that love was not a cage. It was a door she could walk through. She spent the rest of the morning cleaning, not to erase, but to begin again. She opened the windows and let the air move freely, the smell of old secrets fading into something cleaner. She brewed coffee, set 2 cups on the table, and when her husband entered the room, she looked at him not as a wife waiting for forgiveness, but as a woman capable of speaking. He sat across from her, waiting for the familiar performance, but it never came. She said his name, the sound clear, steady, alive, and then she told him everything she had never said, not to accuse, not to wound, but to release every unspoken truth, every swallowed word, every ache disguised as loyalty. Her voice didn't shake. It rang through the house like a bell, calling the silence to an end. He listened, and for once, she didn't have to wonder if he understood, because understanding no longer mattered. She wasn't speaking for him. She was speaking for herself. When she finished, she stood up, her body trembling, but her breath steady. She walked outside into the light. The world felt wide, endless, unfamiliar. She didn't look back, because the past was finally still, and she was finally not. She understood now that love without voice is just another kind of disappearance. She had loved in silence, but she would live in sound from that day on. If this story touched something inside you, subscribe to Asterisk, the silent truth asterisk, and tell us in the comments if you've ever lived something like this, or if you know someone who did.